So yeah, just a little bit on my background that you know where I'm coming from. So my name is Jokschus. I work at the Otto von Guericke University in Magdeburg in the field of literary and urban cultural studies. So especially the Anglophone field, just to get an idea. So many people come from so many angles. What's my angle now? And I must begin this presentation with a heavy confession, and that is never in my life have I played a single round of Warhammer 40,000, nor any tabletop wargame for that matter. Still, I count myself among those who passionately pursue the hobby, finding great enjoyment in the collection, painting, and crafting of miniature models. Chaos tanks are a particular passion of mine, so much so that my numerous projects got me thinking about crafting as more than the mere preparation for a game that never comes, but a form of metagaming in its own right, one that involves fellow humans less than it does an assortment of material agents like green stuff, plastic card, and expanding foam. Frustratingly, at times, I have found these playmates to be disobedient, never submitting to my plans like some ready-to-hand servants, but involving me in a choreography of creative becoming through affordances they hold and limits they impose. What this involvement has yielded beyond the models you see here is the recognition of intriguing synergies between materiality, play, and lore. In my talk, I want to expand on this observation and the experience of co-constructive entanglement through crafting by suggesting a media ecological approach to Warhammer 40,000 that expands its transmedial storytelling towards the literal stuff that games are made of. To do so, I first want to briefly outline what I mean by materiality, by affordance, and by media ecology before illustrating these concepts with the help of examples drawn from online spaces that gravitate the hobby. In line with the ethos of such spaces, I consider this talk a work in progress that welcomes and appreciates your feedback. When discussing the materiality of games, conversations usually follow one of three argumentative routes, focusing either on the experience of human players in the flesh, on commercial aspects of production and distribution, or on the unflattening quality that tangible game pieces bring to paper-bound or digital games. What each route presupposes is a rigid separation between active human subject and passive material object, thus reflecting the traditional Western conception of the Cartesian cogito standing on top of and distinct from a world of mere matter. It was only in the mid-1990s that a new materialism was forwarded to challenge cultural theory based on linguistic and social constructivism and rediscover matter as a vibrant and lively network of relations in which the human is enmeshed on eye level with everything. As Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost summarize, new materialists discern emergent generative powers or agentive capacities, even within inorganic matter, and generally eschew the distinction between organic and inorganic or animate and inanimate at the ontological level. Central to this conception is a focus on intra-action, a term Karen Barat uses to highlight that agency is no inherent property of an individual or human to be exercised, but a dynamism of forces in which all designated things are constantly exchanging and diffracting, influencing and working inseparably. When it comes to games, new materialists are therefore less interested in interactions that flow from human to game piece, the rolling of a die or the pushing of a miniature from A to B, than they are in the intra-actions between a range of agencies and co-actors, human and otherwise. In their edited volume on the topic, Paul Wake and Chloe Germain accordingly define material game studies as a discipline that draws on the idea of post-human performativity to suggest that games are not brought into being by human minds and actions, but that there is a much more complex material discursive entanglement at work from which human players are not separable. After all, a productive ambiguity already haunts the phrase to play with something, as it denotes both linear manipulation as well as cooperation. Returning to one of my chaos tanks for illustration, the process of its creation has involved me in interactions with wood, aluminum foil, polymer clay, and plastic, none of which behaved as passively as I might have liked, but actively limiting certain moves while affording others. For instance, while wooden plates afforded the cuboid shape and stability of the overall tank form, the subtractive nature of its malleability meant that symmetry demanded finesse that my manual skills could not afford. While traditional materialism would qualify this encounter as a failure on my side to sufficiently impose my agency to inert stuff, new materialism invites us to consider the material properties of wood as a form of agency in its own right, and the self, in turn, as a component set of abilities and skills. Ultimately, I opted for covering half of the wooden structure in clay, acknowledging the limitations that wood had set me and playing along. That clay, however, came with limitations of its own, demanding baking at temperatures that the plastic gun barrel originally adorning the tank could not withstand without melting. By virtue of its phase-changing affordances, polymer clay thus demanded replacing that barrel with one made from wood. The result of this co-creative back and forth is a tank model swallowed halfway by Nörglish growth, a compromise between all agencies involved and far removed from my original vision of a pristine Cadian tank. Trust the process, a phrase commonly used in the hobby space, captures this interactional openness to involving oneself in a process that, following Roger Caillois, shares many similarities with paideia, a form of playful behavior characterized by free improvisation and carefree gaiety. According to Ian Bogost, in fact, all play might be considered an operation of structures constrained by limitations. What it means to play, he argues, is to take something, anything, on its own terms, to treat it as if its existence were reasonable. The power of games lies not in their capacity to deliver rewards or enjoyment, but in the structured constraint of their design, which opens abundant possible spaces for play. During crafting, I take serious the fact that it's never just me, but also things that want to play, that display agency and that force me to renegotiate what can and cannot be done. It is at this point, however, that accounts of material gaming still tend to draw a more or less pronounced line. For instance, when, and here I butcher the pronunciation, Mikko Merlienen, Katrina Heljaka, and Jaakko Stenros broadly define miniaturing as being organized around a dual core of crafting and gaming, their splitting delimits the involvement of material agencies to the former category alone. Once the model emerges from playfully co-creative crafting and enters the tabletop as a unit, it becomes appropriated by a ludic narrative system in which it no longer has meaningful say. Materiality no longer matters here. If human players agreed, a pocket book or tissue box could proxy as a chaos tank. Of course, while such an agreement surely benefited players' wallets, it would crucially subtract from the special appeal that wargamers bring to the tabletop. What makes Warhammer 40,000 popular and recognizable is largely carried by the indexicality of its miniatures, the WYSIWYG philosophy of Games Workshop's product design to perform the mergence of ludic and narrative elements. If, as Marco Arnaldo argues, games are story engines made up of ludic and narrative gears, miniatures may be said to be the spark plugs that get the whole thing going. It is therefore necessary to consider the synergies that occur when materiality meets narrative. The groundwork for thinking through such synergies has been laid by an ecological turn in literary studies that, broadly speaking, applies media theory to the study of text. The theory referenced stretches the media terminus beyond technological data carriers to denote material environments in general, taking its beginning in the writings of Marshall McLuhan. His famous mantra that the medium is the message encapsulates a redirection of attention towards that which typically eludes conscious perception, namely the fact that each medium has its own particular grammar, a set of rules and structure for making meaningful messages, and therefore each medium has its own particular bias towards the kinds of content that works best with it. For literary studies, this has meant interrogating narratives on the ways that formal biases afford and limit content. For example, the sonnet, brief and condensed, best affords a single idea or experience, while the triple-decker novel affords elaborate processes of character development in multi-plot social contexts. The point is not to suggest that literal forms determine content, but that each carries specific biases that influence the way stories are being told. What biases then do crafting materials bring to the story world of Warhammer 40,000? While it is impossible to reduce the transmedial cosmos that composes the game's lore to a single plot, I propose for the sake of argument that Warhammer 40,000's central diegetic conflict revolves around the Imperium of men fighting the forces of chaos. I argue that central characteristics of both fictional parties find themselves reflected in different kinds of material that typically partake in the crafting of respective gaming units, thus extending the medium towards the message via indexical storytelling. Looking to the Imperium of Men, its rich description within the game's lore provides the groundwork for much of 40k's grimdark aesthetic. Numerous texts depict a totalitarian techno-feudal system of more or less unified groups that maintains its power through extreme militarism, colossal bureaucracy, and a fanatic state religion. One quotation taken from Warhammer 40,000's 1989 compendium summarizes the ideological tenets of that system neatly. My will be done. In the 41st millennium, humankind declares the egocentric divine and pursues a holy mission to subjugate the non-human other, conducting unimaginable attrition warfare reliant on hyper-forced production regimes. A hint of such desire can be traced in faction-specific crafting content uploaded to online miniaturing spaces. This tutorial for a custom Baneblade model uploaded to WH40k by Mike Berg may serve as an example. Through meticulously planned out cutting templates and a step-by-step assembly guide, Berg promises no less than exact replicability. The same Baneblade can be reproduced indefinitely, each identical to the one before. Appropriating a terminus suggested by Danielle Almeida and Jonathan Feitosa Ferreira, what Berg presents here is a pre-established playing script that structures the crafting process in totalitarian fashion, aiming to eradicate interactive co-creation by neutering the agentive capacities of the material. My point is not to disparage Berg's guide at all, quite the contrary, as it performs a poignant manifestation of the Imperium's rigorous planology. When Rogel Dawn, in this quote from the novel I Am Slaughter, spotlights the importance that plans have for the Imperium, insisting that every eventuality during contact with the enemy must be prefigured, he effectively reiterates the same planological ideal that Joel Meyer de Caceres, in the context of town planning, once championed as the elimination of material, physical disorder and imperfection which hinder the highest human evolution. What are empires, after all, if not massive planning institutions that demand constant reproduction of standardized procedures to maintain power? By following Berg's guide, the hobbyist performs in equivalence to the planological unit production that the Imperium of Men, the grotesque exaggeration of real-life imperialism, enforces in its Forge worlds. Vice versa, a similar convergence can, in an inverted form, be traced in online crafting content that circulates the forces of chaos. Fittingly, for a war that spans more than 10 millennia, chaos presents the polar opposite to the planological ideal. Routine turns to entropy, order to disorder, and discipline gives way to unbridled desires. While there are 4 chaos gods to personify these reversals, I will focus on Nurgle, the Plague Lord, for this moment. As we learn from several Chaos Marine codices, a chaos god can only grow in power through the actions and thoughts of mortals, proposing a parasitic form of agency that the physical corruption exuded by Nurgle captures in the flesh. Disease and putrefaction, the reader is told, are the wonders he bestows, transforming devotees into bloated vectors of decay, sealing their gaping wounds with pulsating growths. In true body horror fashion, Nurgle manifests the body unbound, sprawling flesh that swallows shape. His affront to the Imperium's imposition of will manifests in a disobedient willfulness imbued in the material itself. As Natalie Wilson outlines in her book on willful monstrosity, it is willfulness that turns an otherwise willing subject of ideology into a dissident source of threat. Once again, crafting performs in equivalence to this acknowledgement, whereas the step-by-step tutorial shown earlier attempted to enforce a pre-configured plan, crafting for chaos frequently entails letting the material exercise a will of its own. For instance, this tutorial on the Nurglification of an Imperial Knight, uploaded by Pandora's Bitsbox, warns the hobbyist immediately that the expanding form involved is difficult to control. Instead of issuing deterministic templates, it encourages experiments with the expanding form, with the author openly confessing that they couldn't really repeat any sort of shape with reliable accuracy. Crafting for chaos becomes crafting with chaos. as expanding foam not only captures Nurgle's bloat aesthetically, but synergizes on an ideological level as well, materializing a sense of willful disobedience to planological control. This Instagram post by Totally Not Panicking summarizes this antithesis neatly, encouraging hobbyists to let the non-human other do the heavy lifting. To use art historical terms, whereas crafting for the Imperium recalls a neoclassical subjugation of the material to rational order and exact calculation, crafting with chaos evokes the complementary ideal of the neo-Baroque, defined by Angela Andalianis as the refusal to respect the limits of the frame and thus a conscious playing into and along with the exuberance of the material. To sum up, the title of my talk announced an attempt to approach Warhammer 40,000 media ecologically. The productive synergies between narrative and material that my analysis of the crafting side of the hobby has hopefully highlighted can only scratch the surface of that task. Miniature models are fusion points, combining material, ludic, and narrative elements to tell 40k's story. The crafting process is only one of many ways in which this fusion manifests. Think of the blemishes that result from frequent handling of one's miniature and how one might incorporate them as indices of battle damage into narrative backstories or translate them into homebrew game rules to reflect hardened war experience. Or think of hobby content on platforms like YouTube, where some of the biggest creators have foregone straightforward tutorials in favor of chronicling their creative endeavors as a series of entertaining setbacks. Channels like Miscast, Bill Making Stuff, or Tabletop Time frequently reverse WYSIWYG when conceiving backstories to fit miniatures that look one way or the other because materials demand it so. Or think of Games Workshop as a corporate entity that stamps down on community creativity in the name of IP protection. The hobbyist, by foregoing store-bought models in favor of poaching third-party materials, performs a form of resistive bricolage that channels a chaotic affront to monopolistic structures. In all of these cases, it is the material that matters, involving itself in every aspect of the tabletop wargame. One day, I may even find the inspiration to play my first round of Warhammer 40,000, but until then, more chaos tanks need crafting. So thank you, and check out my references.